Hello friends, welcome to Linux Beginner to Pro series. Today is our day 1 and we are going to have introduction to Linux. And in this video we'll be learning what is Linux and what are its core components and origin of Linux, and then what is open source concept, Linux versus Unix versus Windows, and also top benefits of learning Linux and the career opportunities in Linux. Okay, so let's start. First, we'll understand what is Linux. As you would have heard, Linux is an operating system, but actually it is not. Linux is not an operating system, but it is a kernel, okay, which was created based on Unix, and Linux kernel was distributed as an open source software, which was later developed by multiple organizations like Red Hat, Ubuntu, SUSE, and it was also used by a community to develop an operating system which you know as CentOS, which stands for Community Enterprise Operating System. And there are multiple Linux based operating systems which are known as Linux distros or Linux flavors, but actually there is no operating system called just Linux, right? And Linux is a very powerful operating system base, and it manages all the hardware and software resources on your computer, and it functions mostly similar to Windows and macOS, but actually it is built on a different kernel, and it has more security features and more reliability, more stability. Along with that, it is quite resource friendly, and obviously it is free to use. Now let's talk about core components of Linux. The first core component is kernel. If you know, kernel is the soul of the operating system, or it is the base of the operating system without having many utility softwares. It is just like a initial software code which is made for any software, but mostly for the operating systems, kernel works as an interpreter as well as the basic source code. Okay, next is shell. Shell is basically a software which provides you command line interface, and so that you can interact with the computer, and you can input your commands and get the outputs. Next is utilities. Utilities are basic softwares. If you have seen in Windows, the notepad, the calculator, these are the basic utility softwares. Next is desktop environment. So mostly we use Linux based on CLI. We do not use GUI in Linux, but there are desktop environments in most of the Linux operating systems nowadays, even Red Hat, CentOS, and Ubuntu. Ubuntu was primarily created for user desktop, end user desktop, so it was having a good GUI from initial stages itself, but Red Hat and CentOS are still developing the GUI. And next is distributions. So distributions are like all the operating systems which are created based on the Linux kernel. And you can see the image here. On the image you can understand there is the hardware platform. On top of that, your kernel code will be there. On the kernel code, your main kernel, and once the kernel will be called by a system call interface, your user applications can use the kernel, and they can use the applications. So basically, if you talk about CLI, there is hardware. On top of that, we have kernel. On top of kernel, we have shell, and on shell, we have the user interactive terminals where we execute our commands and get the outputs. How Linux came into the picture. Let's talk about the origin story and what is open source. So Linux was developed by Linus Torvalds. Let's go back to the history and understand there were two most dominating operating systems in the market. One was Unix, and another one was MS-DOS. Unix was also not an operating system, but it was a kernel which was distributed among few companies. Actually, it was sold to those companies. For example, Unix was sold to HP, Oracle, not Oracle primarily, it was sold to Sun Solaris. Unix kernel was sold to HP, Sun Microsystems, IBM, Apple, and they created their own operating systems like HP developed HPUX, IBM developed AIX, and Sun Microsystems created their Sun Solaris operating system, and Apple, as you know, the macOS. It is also based on Unix, and MS-DOS, if you know, was slowly developed, and what you see in Microsoft Windows was historically MS-DOS. So these two operating systems were the two most dominating operating systems in the market. But the problem with Unix distributions like HPUX and IBM AX was that these operating systems were compatible only with their original equipment manufacturer, that in short called as OEM. In the OEM hardware only it was supporting. So problem uh, with the customer was that if they want to change the software only, or if they want to change the hardware only, they have to change everything. For example, if someone is using HPUX, so they have the HP server hardware and HPUX operating system. If they want to change from HPUX to IBM AIX, they will have to change operating system as well as the hardware. So they will have to go to the IBM hardware, and then only they can use IBM AIX. So this was creating kind of a monopoly, or you can call rigidness into the market, that you cannot change only software or only hardware. You have to change both, which was very costly to the customer, and even if they are thinking, they have to think about cost as well. So they were not switching that easily. Keeping this in mind, Linux Torvalds thought about creating a free operating system, open source operating system, that is free for everyone to use, to install. But later on, when these operating systems were developed, for example Red Hat, SUSE, Linux Enterprise Server, or CentOS or Ubuntu, most of these operating systems were developed by the companies who were providing support as well on this operating system in the case of failure which a Linux administrator is not able to solve. These companies had the dedicated support team, and these guys will support you in case if your server is not coming up, not booting up, or there are other problems related to the operating system and also the updates. So all these services are paid. Even if you take any of the Linux operating system which you think is free, it's not exactly free in case of support and service. It is free to use, free to install. You can use it as long as it is not going down. Okay, so Linus Torvalds created uh, Linux kernel in 1991, and it was made open source in 1992. So it was developed, it was distributed among multiple developers and companies. They created their own distributions. What do you understand with open source? If you are understanding with open source is that it is free, yes, that's true, but that's not the exact meaning of open source. Open source directly stands for an kernel or a software which is having a open source code, which is easily available and freely available for the users. They can use it, they can modify it, and they can redistribute it. That is the exact meaning of open source softwares. Okay, moving on to understand the difference between multiple operating systems. Let us compare Linux with Unix and Windows. If we talk about licensing, Unix and Windows both are proprietary. They have paid license, but Linux is open source, that means free to use and modify. However, if you want services, they are again paid. So we are not talking about the services, we're just talking about the installation and usage. Then who developed Unix? Unix was developed by AT&T, Bell Labs, and vendors. Obviously, that vendors which I talked about: HP, IBM, Sun Microsystems, and Apple. And Linux was developed by Linus Torvalds independently, and again all the distributions were developed by the community. And Windows is directly a proprietary software of Microsoft Corporation. Okay, third is kernel type. In Unix it is monolithic or hybrid, it depends on the particular distribution. And Linux is monolithic kernel, Windows is having hybrid kernel. Unix primarily focuses on enterprise services and academics to learn about Unix and the future Unix based operating systems. Linux mostly focuses on servers, cloud, desktop, and Internet of Things. We will talk about where can we install the operating systems and how did we feel the need of VMware instead of physical servers, and after that how did we think about cloud services. So we'll talk about it later. Then Windows was mostly developed for personal computing. If you see all the most of the end users or users like us, we use Windows for our personal uses. We do not prefer Linux. However, 90% of the world's servers run on Linux. And nowadays, if you see the Android operating system, which is in your hand right now, this is also based on Linux. Android is the most used operating system across the world on mobile devices, and nowadays it is on televisions as well. Next is stability. Unix is extremely stable. Linux is also extremely stable. Stable in the sense it does not reboots automatically and it does not crash automatically unless there is a major issue. Linux and Unix are very much stable, and Windows is also stable, but in some cases because of the attacks or because of the higher resources utilization, Windows goes unstable. And Unix and Linux are case sensitive. So whether it is a name or username, file name, directory name, all the things are case sensitive. If you see the example, small f ile.txt is not equal to capital F ile.txt. So file name will change if you just change the case. These operating systems, Unix and Linux, both are case sensitive, while Windows is not as much, because in the password cases, obviously Windows is also case sensitive, but in most of the cases, Windows is not so case sensitive. Okay. Now let me talk about what benefits do you get if you learn Linux. The first benefit you get is career and industry. That means Linux is essential tool for cloud, for DevOps, for SRE roles, cybersecurity roles, and you take emerging technologies are AI, ML, MLOps. These technologies also need Linux as the foundation, and Linux is the kind of powerhouse for most of the servers running nowadays. That is why you see the more you get the Linux servers in the environment, the more you get the openings and opportunities for you. The only difficulty is to learn and remember the Linux commands and scripting methods, and then steps to perform certain tasks. This is it's not difficult, but it is difficult to remember if you don't practice. So I will always suggest you to keep on practicing along with me. Second thing, security and stability. As you all know, Linux is pretty secure when we compare it to Windows. There are reasons behind it. Linux is always having by design more features that prevents the hacking or penetration into the server. However, there is one major reason behind Linux being more secure than Windows is Windows user base. Since Windows has larger user base, we have larger number of spywares, malwares, threats, worms, and different kind of viruses. And since Linux is not in the end user's hands, there are not much work done on the viruses for Linux. So Linux catches viruses very rarely. However, Windows has the more chances of it. Apart from this, login restrictions and SE Linux and permissions make Linux more secure. We will learn about more PAM module and permissions and SE Linux and all the security methods which we use in Linux to make it more secure. Third, flexibility and customization. As you know, Linux has open source kernel, so we can modify it as per our requirement. If you see the examples of the Linux distributions like Ubuntu or CentOS or Kali Linux. What is the difference between all these three operating systems? Kali Linux is made for vulnerability and penetration test or ethical hacking, and Ubuntu is used for end user computing, which is having more desktop functionalities, and CentOS is mostly used for enterprise server, basically for running the application, web or DB services, right? So it is created based on the single kernel but differently as per the requirement. Fourth, cost and community. So as you know, it is completely free to use and install unless you want services. Even if you talk about the services, as I have seen in my past experience, Red Hat or SUSE cost around 1 by 5 to 1 by 6th of Windows cost. So you can afford 6 or 5 to 6 Linux servers in the cost of one Windows server. And since we have a large community of Linux users, we can get more support on it. Even if you are using CentOS and if you are facing any issues on the operating system, that is not booting up or file system got corrupted or any kind of issues, you can simply go and ask to the community. Whoever is having the solution will voluntarily give you answers and you can solve your problems. Next, command line mastery. So when you use Linux, you get mastery into the command line usage. As much as you are perfect with the command line usage, you can become more expert or it will be more easy to understand Ansible, Jenkins, and other Docker and Kubernetes and macOS tools. So your CLI makes you more technical instead of using GUI that even a child can use now. But what makes you different from other technical users is when you use CLI, you have more command, more power in your hands to control the operating system as per your needs. You should start learning now, as we have started with this introduction class. Hope you would have understood the purpose, the origin, open source, and comparison with the different operating systems of Linux. So you should start learning now. Tomorrow we will have the lab setup on our own laptop so that we can learn and practice Linux parallelly with me. Thank you so much for staying with us. Please like and share to the people who may need these classes, and subscribe our channel for more updates. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can post it into our comment box, and we'll be answering as soon as I see it, maybe in the chat itself or in the next videos. Thank you.